So welcome to the latest Thought Leaders podcast from the Icehouse. I'm Gavin Lennox. So while the world is grappling with the global crisis posed by COVID-19, there's another global issue that has much longer reaching impacts on not just business, but on our very existence on this planet, and that's climate change. In that context, I'd like to welcome Rod Oram, a longtime contributor and supporter of the Icehouse, and an advocate for the environment and for business. Rod's currently in Glasgow at the COP26 Conference, which has been billed as the last chance for humanity to address carbon emissions before it's too late. Global conferences like COP26 and the issues like climate change may seem distant and something addressed at intergovernment level rather than at a business level. I'd therefore like to ask Rod not only about the conference and the broader climate change issues, but also its relevance to our listeners, the owners and leaders of Kiwi businesses, and what they can do to adapt and potentially be part of the solution. So welcome, Rod.
Well, good evening, Gavin. Good evening, my time, morning yours. It's a great pleasure to be having a good old chat with you.
Yeah, thank you, Rod. So let's just start with a few opening questions. Most people would have read on the news about what COP26, but what is it and why is it taking place?
Well, COP stands for Conference of the Parties, i.e. all those countries of the world, which is actually all of them, that have signed up to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so COP is the annual negotiations to advance that. The big breakthrough was 2015 in Paris, where countries agreed to put nationally determined contributions, their climate pledges, on the table. And so all the work since then has been to operationalize Paris, and I'll come back to the work that still needs to be done here on that, but also crucially for countries to ratchet up their commitments, because the science has moved on very considerably, and we can't hang around with just trying to achieve only a 2% rise in temperature. We now have to focus on 1.5, because anything more than that, that starts to have really big climate impact in terms of more storms, more biodiversity loss, more ecosystem degradation, and the rest. So that's why it's so important.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds pretty fundamental, but we've also heard on the news that there's a sense of talk but no action. Let's get your views on that, being on the ground there. And I know you've been a real advocate for action versus just talking. Maybe you could talk at a broad level where you see real commitments or not being made. And then also, how does New Zealand come out of that? What commitments have we made and our actions?
The best way to think of the trajectory of these negotiations over recent years is that for a long time, the negotiations were all about struggling and failing to decide how to divide up the pain of addressing the climate crisis, like who was going to cut emissions and how are they going to pay for it. But because technologies have moved on so fast and business and finance have moved on so fast, it's now all about sharing the gains. In other words, how do you get renewable energy, renewable electricity out to the smallest, poorest countries in the world, now that renewable electricity is cheaper than any other form of electricity generation. So that has considerably changed the dynamic here, but it hasn't solved all the problems. On the positive side, there is a huge engagement for business, and Mark Carney, who is a former governor of the Bank of England, who is co-leader of the UN effort to line up private sector finance, declared a few days ago that now institutional investors and other sorts of capital holding 130 trillion US dollars of capital are saying they are keen to invest along these lines. Again, that doesn't solve all the problems. You have to operationalize all that, but that's the huge shift. We see now, for example, the speed with which electric vehicles are coming on, and so we will probably see in some key markets very few fossil fuel cars still being made by 2035, and possibly even earlier than that. So there is this big shift where there is an awful lot of doing going on. And for me as a business journalist, it's quite fascinating to see here and take the pulse here on that very big shift by business, not just the big multinationals, but all the way down to small companies too. And I'll come back to that in the context of companies in the Icehouse. But that's the big thing going on. Still lots to do on the government side, because we still need those overarching frameworks and alliances and compacts, and crucially the rule book, the Article 6 rule book, as it's called, to make sure, for example, that carbon markets are transparent and well disciplined and properly reported. Governments, of course, really struggle because they have to have unanimous agreement of all countries on that. So it's a very laborious process. But it is really unfair to say that it's all pledges and no action. Yes, there are pledges, lots to operationalize, but a fair amount of that work's already underway.
Well, that's really encouraging. I mean, we've been hearing some, the blah, blah, blah from Greta Thunberg and a sort of no action, but you seem more positive, which is great, and you're seeing investment money following this opportunity, which I think is a really another interesting thread I'd like to talk with you about, around how technology and investment could see this as an opportunity rather than just a cost on business. If we could turn to climate change and New Zealand. So what are you hearing from other developing countries or developed countries, in particular maybe the Scandinavian countries? What practices are they adopting to get public momentum behind the ambitions, and how's New Zealand seen in that context?
There is a great diversity across the world, and in terms of the countries that have got their plans for the very long transition to a net zero economy or carbon neutral economy by 2050, and to make big cuts in emissions by 2030 along that way, to make sure that it's a doable pathway, and that 2030 benchmark is 50% cut. So there are some standouts. So the EU, in terms of policies, regulatory practices, and all the work that's underway, and a focus of investment, not just at an EU level in terms of overarching coordination, but many countries within. So Germany, for example, is good on that. And then elsewhere in Europe, the Scandinavian countries are very engaged. The UK has really come to the forefront. It's been long engaged on the same regulatory and climate change commission, although they call it the committee here rather than the commission as we do in New Zealand. The UK started that kind of process back in 2008 and has achieved some very big reductions in emissions, particularly in the energy system. And the big step forward for the UK this year is to bring out its long-term net zero strategy. This only came out just before COP. And again, there are big gaps, but in that framework, you can start to see what all the pathways can be towards net zero. Now, by comparison, we're behind on that in New Zealand. Okay. So we've had our climate change commission offer its advice to government in mid-year, and the government was supposed to then come back with its emissions reduction plan by late this year, but it's pushed that out to May of next. And my big concern is that our government agencies, ministries and the like, are really struggling to come up with the policies and bring these integrated suites of policies together, and they're struggling because there is a lack of political leadership on that from the government. I think that's where we really are needing to put an awful lot more effort into that, to make sure we've got the groundwork from government that business needs to know the framework in which it's working.
Well, one of the big parts of our economy is agriculture, particularly beef and dairy farming. We hear not only about carbon emissions around carbon dioxide, but we're increasingly hearing about the effects of methane, which is one of the byproducts of that farming industry, and particularly, I guess, a contributing factor for New Zealand's carbon footprint. Can you give us a view on the methane or nitrous oxide from agriculture, where New Zealand stands in that, how important that is for our future contributions to climate change?
It's really important because agriculture in total is about 48% of our emissions in New Zealand. The largest part of that, very considerable part of that, is from methane, and the rest from nitrous oxide. And indeed that, for example, makes Fonterra and its farmers the largest single source of greenhouse gases in New Zealand at somewhere around about 20 or 22%. So quite simply, in New Zealand, we can't meet the commitments we've made to the world if there isn't a quite significant reduction in agricultural emissions to go alongside the far bigger reductions in emissions from the rest of the economy by, for example, starting to decarbonize transport. And our primary sector is very reluctant to commit to much on that. Indeed, they're barely committing to anything more than their existing trajectory over the last 20 years on methane reduction, which had been going at about 1% a year over all of those years in terms of methane intensity, either in milk or meat. Meanwhile, what the big change in the global picture is that methane has rocketed right to the top of the climate agenda. And that's happened for two reasons. The first one is there is a rather more confidence around the reduction in CO2 emissions now that we're starting to see the likes of electric vehicles and very cheap renewable electricity. So there is the possibility, for example, of the last of coal-fired electricity generation being phased out relatively quickly over, say, the next 10 years. But that means lots of work still to do there. But methane's come to the fore because there was no plan for methane. But secondly, methane is an astonishingly potent greenhouse gas. And it's been responsible for about 40% of warming over the last few decades. And methane levels, emissions are rising faster than CO2. Right. So therefore, the push is to now get reductions on methane. That's why the US and the EU launched an alliance targeting a 30% cut in methane emissions by 2030. And more than 100 countries have signed up to that, including New Zealand. Okay. Now, the focus initially is on methane leaks, particularly from gas pipelines, but elsewhere in the oil and gas production and transmission system. But that does not let farming off the hook. There will be increasing emphasis on methane reduction in agriculture. And our farming sector does not have the leisurely timetable that it thinks it has to get that done. And because things are moving much faster, both on the regulatory side, but also in terms of improvements in farming systems elsewhere in the world. So what should farmers significantly behind the curve on.
So a number of the Icehouse alumni are from the farming and agriculture community. What do you think they could and should do as part of this? Because it sounds like a very big problem, but what are the practical steps that some farmers can take to help with that 48% of our emissions coming from agriculture, of which a big proportion comes from methane?
The most important thing, and this applies across all of human activity, this is not something just for farmers, is that we have to understand that the timetable for these emissions reductions is being set by physics and by nature, not by politicians. And so the climate is changing, and it's completely impervious to whatever we're doing other than reducing emissions. So that's why every emitter has to take responsibility for their emissions now and work very hard on reducing those emissions fast. That means you have to set yourself goals, ambitious goals, that you don't know how to achieve. But in setting those goals, that focuses your mind and your R&D and your business practices around finding those solutions.
Mm.
So my message to farmers is you've got to set those ambitious goals, and you've then got to really ramp up the activity to make sure we can achieve them. Because the money we spend on agricultural science in New Zealand, and particularly around reducing emissions, is a pitiful sum, given that the broad farming sector is responsible for about $20 billion or so of revenues a year. And we're spending sort of more like 10 or $15 million a year on that science. A lot of that's going to have to come from government, but the government is not going to be prepared to spend that money unless it feels that it's got real support from the farming community for that big push. So that's the first thing. The next thing is that there is a lot that farmers can do in the meantime. So we can look at some farms that are doing very well on reducing methane, and that's by some changes in farming practices, some change in the mix of feed that the animals are getting, and there are a number of examples, and there are examples within, for example, the Dairy New Zealand Monitor Farm program. So we know what can be done, and the ability for farms to pursue various of those options varies by the nature of the farm. But we've got such a weak system in New Zealand for trying to get that knowledge about better farming practices out to farmers and encourage them to take them up. So those are all the things we should be doing very, very fast and effectively, like right now, and ramp that up over the next year or two.
One of the things that I know, you talked about setting goals, but not quite understanding how to achieve them will drive innovation. That's been kind of like, I guess a human way of solving issues. You may not know the solution, but you know where you want to get to. So, and one of the things that I know, Scott Morrison, an Australian's so-called net zero policy that was published a few days before COP26, had a big set of unknowns around unknown technologies that might solve or help solve the problem. Have you seen anything at COP26 that is actually really interesting globally, but also in a New Zealand context, that could help transform our carbon footprint as a species or as a country?
Nothing new that has some sign of credibility. The way, look, I'm perfectly need to stress that I'm not seeing everything and hearing everything, so things might be out there. In terms of on the energy side, though, it's really important, the roadmap that the International Energy Agency came out with earlier this year, which was a pathway to net zero for the entire global energy system, not just electricity, but transport and the rest, to 2050 by using existing or technologies that at the newest are at least in pilot stage now. We're not waiting around for things that have yet to be invented. So we can broadly, I stress the broad, have some degree of confidence about that. On the methane side, though, that is far from clear. And there's an amazing amount of work still to be done. But there are some very innovative New Zealand companies that are working on that. And I do have some hopes. But meanwhile, what's going on in agriculture is a far bigger shift. So we're seeing a lot of competition from plant-based foods, but also from food technology that doesn't require any land, such as growing meat from stem cells, or using bioreactors to brew an equivalent of milk, for example, or indeed growing things naturally, but in entirely climate-controlled buildings, and growing it aeroponically, not even hydroponically. using LED lights, which are now, of course, very cheap to use, and you can keep adjusting the wavelength of those lights to achieve different growing systems. So all that's incredibly positive. But what with changing diets, and those are changing quite rapidly in terms of the people who are moving away from meat and dairy products, our farmers need to understand that there is far more going on in global farming systems and food than they are responding to. Now, there is still a big future for them by producing natural products, as long as they can deal with all the adverse consequences of that. Because a really important concept here is we have these other technologies on food, but they can only get down to zero impact on ecosystems. But if we farm, indeed other farmers also farm absolutely in tune with nature, that means they can help nature restore, they can help rebuild ecosystems. So farming has this potential to be a very positive impact on ecosystems, but it's absolutely got to deal with the methane problem. There is absolutely no way around it.
A number of the farmers that I've spoken to in my travels around New Zealand definitely see themselves as guardians of the land, and having a very long-term intergenerational relationship with that land rather than a plundering approach. So hopefully those core values can help, together with targets that maybe are challenging, can help deliver the solutions we need. I don't think there's an inherent resource extraction approach to agriculture here, but maybe I'm wrong. But that was just my impressions.
That is generally true, but there are certainly you have a bell curve, and that would be true of a majority. But there are intensive farming operations in New Zealand that do breach those sensible boundaries. But I want to add, I think, make a point, and I'm sorry to sound as though I make no apology about repeating the methane message. I know farmers. I spend a lot of time in the primary sector, and they are very good guardians of their land, and they have that intergenerational view, but they still don't understand that methane cannot be sequestered. And even if you have wonderful plantings on your farm, the fact that the methane is so potent means you would never probably be able to plant enough to sequester an equivalent amount of CO2 to compensate for the methane. And I'm afraid the dominant view still is that methane's a short-lived gas, so we needn't worry about it because the methane I'm putting up there now is going to go away. But the point is, you keep putting it up there, that means you are a constant pressure on the climate, and that methane is so potent that it's causing all this damage. And that's why I think if there's a single issue in terms of our climate response in New Zealand, it's got to be about getting that message about methane across and about how food systems and farming are changing around the world. I would feel a lot more confident about our progress if we had a big breakthrough on those 2 points.
So thanks for that. But let me sort of draw a conclusion and try, not a conclusion because it's such a broad topic, but maybe look into some practical stuff for some of our owner managers. Many of them, although agriculture is one of the, say, top 5 or 6 sectors that we serve, many of them are more, I would call, regular businesses. Construction firms, professional services organizations, accountancies, retailers. To them, climate change seems like something happening rather than an opportunity, and maybe a cost. What advice would you have, or thoughts would you have, that could be practically implemented where real businesses in New Zealand that support, that mid-tier of SME companies that probably contribute? There's probably 50 to 60,000 organizations that contribute about a third of our GDP. So very important foothold or footprint. What can they do? What could they do practically?
The first point is to for us humans to realize that the 7.8 billion of us on the planet are already using, depending how you count, somewhere between 2 and 3 planets worth of resources. So this isn't just about the climate crisis, but it's the related crisis, the co-crisis of ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss. And climate change causes that, and solutions to one help supports the other. But we still have this monumental problem of our resource use. So we've got to reinvent, sorry, this sounds terribly simplistic. It's obviously terribly hard to eventually do this over a long period of time, is to make sure that everything we do works with nature and not against it. And that means that all our material use has to be, we have to have true circular economy principles here. So if you're in retail, you have to be thinking very hard about the nature of the products you sell and whether they can at least be recycled, or at least reused, or last longer, or have a second life and all the rest. So this is about a concept of deep sustainability in terms of everything we do, which applies to every single human activity, and that applies to every business, whatever you're in. And what I see here at COP is this huge expression of business, and it's, large, medium, and small that are really locked on to that. And great opportunities arise from that. One of the things that has been most obvious to me in the long years now that I've been very engaged on these issues, that companies that set themselves the task, the goal of being much more sustainable businesses, think more deeply about the business and are more innovative. And I see it as one of the biggest drivers of innovation in business, but also crucially, one of the biggest drivers of sort of stakeholder, employee, and everybody, customers, everybody else, engagement in that business. So I think it's an immensely powerful driver for better businesses. And a test I love to offer to people is, you name the business, and I'll tell you why I think there's a role in this for you. And I've yet to be stumped by that. And I put that challenge out to all the whole entire Icehouse community. I actually, it'd be wonderful to have kind of a town hall meeting one day where live, I'm challenged on that by whatever crazy kind of mix of companies you could come up with.
Well, we have a thing called Icehouse Central, which all our alumni have signed up to or offered to sign up to, and maybe we'll start a forum in there. Challenge Rod Oram on how how you can get your business aligned with climate change goals and what difference you can make.
No, do. I would certainly welcome that challenge, and I'm very confident. I don't want to sound overconfident, but I've yet to be stumped on that one.
No. Well, look, Rod, I really appreciate you taking the time on a Saturday evening in Glasgow. The things I took away from our conversation, the first one was a sense of optimism, which is really encouraging. You're seeing investment monies flow into the opportunities presented by addressing climate change, which is always a kind of a leading indicator of where things are trending. The second thing I took away was that it's important for all businesses, and particularly the agricultural sector, to set goals. The criticality of methane cannot be understated in the context of New Zealand's contributions to the climate change footprint. And I think the third thing I took away was every business needs to think about how it works with nature, not working against nature, but working together with it and creating a sense of deep sustainability, and seeing that your reflections that smart businesses set themselves goals about sustainability. They tend to think more deeply and innovate and engage with their customers and their suppliers in a thoughtful way that makes them better businesses. So really, lots to think about there. Thank you very much for the latest update, Rob. And we'll take you up on your challenge, Rod, on how climate change affects your business on Icehouse Central. I'm sure Briar and the team will do that. So thanks again for your time.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Gavin. I really appreciate the conversation, and wishing you and your colleagues at the Icehouse and all the businesses in the community all the very best. And
Thank
I
you.
look forward to being back home and out of quarantine by the beginning of December.
We'll see you then, Rod. Cheers.
Okay, thanks. See you.
Bye.